And hello, hi, it's Kathy Frey here from IMCO, from the International Integrated Maternity Healthcare Organisation, and welcome along to this week's webinar, this week's Maternity Natural Health series that we're talking around. And a big welcome today to Dr. Hailey Arnold. Say hello.
Hello, thank you for having me.
It's really great to have you here. And Hailey is coming to us from Houston in Texas, where I happen to be going in a few weeks' time. So that's funny. We're just talking about COVID and catching up on things like that. But we've got a really fascinating topic that we're going to be talking about today, which is absolutely cutting edge and leading edge science. So but firstly, just a little bit of an introduction. So Hailey is a chiropractor and functional medicine practitioner, which she'll explain more about. But we could perhaps best describe her as a health advocate and an entrepreneur, constantly finding solutions to problems. And Hailey spends her days formulating nutritional products and genetic tests for children of all ages. And Dr. Arnold is an active clinician, educator, public speaker, and published author, and with a passion for neurosensory differences and autoimmunity. She believes, of course, as so many of us do now with this epigenetics particularly, is that, long-term health starts very early, preconception basically. But we're going to be talking about today, particularly pediatric nutrition and conversation, having a bit of a conversation about genetics in general. So welcome. Hailey, do you want to start with just, reintroducing yourself and telling us a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So obviously what you just said was perfect. So I am a active clinician, and what I mean by that is I literally have a clinic here in Houston where I'm taking care of kids on the spectrum. They're autoimmune moms because those go hand in hand. And I also educate and lecture around the country to doctors of all varieties, healthcare practitioners of all varieties, especially naturopaths, OBGYNs, that kind of stuff. So genetics is a big topic for me. I'm kind of a nerd that way. And I love using genetic testing in practice because it takes a lot of the guesswork out for a variety of practitioners, depending on, what your niche is. And I love using natural healthcare options when it's possible. So everything from supplements to diet to lifestyle modifications and everything in between is really where my passion lies. And so taking care of moms in the preconception phase, the pregnancy phase, and their kiddos and everything after that, that's where my heart is. And I absolutely love doing it.
Fantastic. And so, that's, what we're all about here, is that understanding that healthcare is integrated, but it's not just about, going to see the doctor for diseases when things have gone wrong. It's that preventative, isn't it, of it, and particularly nutrition. God goodness, I mean, that's our whole body's fuel. So what exactly do you want to explain is nutrition-based genetics? Because this is so cutting edge. And, I just said to you before we started that, what we know now, what science can back up stuff that you've probably known for decades anyway, but what we know now is so different to probably what we're going to be aware of in, say, 20 years from now. But nutrition-based genetics is so leading edge. So do you want to explain that as a bit of an overview to start with?
Sure. So most of us think of genetics as just that basic science of your DNA, your genetic blueprint, if you will. And previous, when we had the Human Genome Project just starting and completing, And when genetics came on the scene, we were really concerned more about genetic mutations that deal with specific diseases like Tay-Sachs or Down syndrome, or, fill in the blank with any disease you can think of from a genetic perspective. Fast forward a couple of decades, and now we know that we can actually use our genes to tell us more information about our body. So the way you metabolize carbohydrates or fatty acids, the way you are built as an athlete. Can you run fast? Are you a sprinter? Are you an endurance athlete? To what vitamins and minerals might you be deficient in, or prone to deficiency, I should say. We can use very specific portions of our genetic code to essentially tweak or optimize our wellness or health. And so nutrition-based genetics, also called nutrigenomics or nutrigenetics, focuses solely on those small little changes in our genetic code that control how we process our food and vitamins and minerals and the like. So I'm able to essentially check for what are called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, which are slight changes in allele pairing that say, okay, you're going to be prone to a folate deficiency, or Sally Jane is going to be prone to obesity based on her genetics, or John Smith is going to be an endurance athlete with low testosterone. We can literally look at these small genetic changes and say, okay, here's your blueprint. Here's what you're predisposed to. Now let's use your diet and lifestyle to optimize your genetic potential. And so we're not worried. It's not medical genetics. We're not worried about the mutations that are going to cause diseases. I leave that to the medical geneticists. We're not talking about ancestry. So I don't need to know if you're Irish or from Saudi Arabia or China, wherever that might be. And it's certainly not paternity testing. So we're not looking for the baby daddy in that regard. We're purely looking at these small genetic changes that can be influenced, if you will, by our environment. So we have this phrase epigenetics that you mentioned a few minutes ago. And that's really the study of how the environment influences our genetic code. Well, it can go the other way around. Our genes can influence how we respond to the environment as well. So I like to, pair the two together. And from, if we're talking maternal health, this is where it can get really interesting, because if we have the female partner and the male partner trying to have a baby, well, sometimes their SNPs can create problems for said child. And so we can get really specific on, okay, during pregnancy, mom needs to focus on her estrogen metabolism and neurotransmitters for certain things. Or, if you want conception to be healthier, dad needs to take X number of micrograms of folate in the methylfolate form. We can get super specific with basically your biochemistry to maintain a healthy pregnancy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that so makes sense. And it's I guess it's a case of you are using nutrition to basically sort of turn on markers that you want turned on and turn off things that you're not wanting. Is it sort of a little bit like that?
Yeah, so that's the turning on and turning off phrases have been used for epigenetics. I'm not so sure if I like that exactly, but we don't have a better vocabulary around that. But yes, absolutely. If you've got genetic markers that say you're prone to a deficiency in vitamin A,
Yes.
then we can say, okay, we're going to use this specific form of vitamin A to hopefully counterbalance your potential. So,
Right.
so yeah.
And so why should we consider genetic testing for maternal health and for our children? Like, if somebody is in that situation where they are because about 50% of babies are planned and 50% are not planned. So with that half that are planned, we talk these days about preconception health, and, enhancing the quality of the ovum and the quality of the sperm and the quality of the womb lining, etc. But where in that timeline does the genetic testing, where do you think that should come in along the spectrum of their journey?
So obviously, if we've got time to plan this conception, I think genetic testing of both partners can be beneficial. For example, here in the States, I don't know about in New Zealand, but here in the States, everyone is kind of obsessed with this one particular gene called MTHFR. And I'm just going to use this as an example because this gene says the purpose of this gene is to essentially metabolize your dietary folate, so your vitamin B9 that you get from spinach and beef liver and other green veggies, to convert it into a cellular form of folate called methylfolate. That's all this gene does. It creates the enzyme that creates that metabolism. However, it's so common, it's upwards of 60% of the population, at least here in the States, has a variation of this gene to where that sets them up for a potential for folate deficiency. And I'm pretty sure we all know how important folate is to a pregnancy, right? It's probably the number one vitamin we say pregnant women need. If we take that a step back and we say, okay, the male partner has an MTHFR variation and the female partner has an MTHFR variation, and they're both kind of set up to be folate deficient. Well, now that if they are folate deficient, then we are going to have poor sperm health. We're going to have low egg count. We're going to have an unhealthy egg, for one thing, and we're going to have imbalanced hormones. So if we do this genetic testing early enough, we can, take 3 to 6 months to optimize their nutrition. Put them on a specific prenatal. Both men and women need a prenatal. Put them on, whatever supplements might be necessary based on their genetics. Or you can even use that information to say, okay, well, your genes say that you are prone to deficiencies. Let's take it a step further and do a blood test or urinalysis to see, are you actually deficient in certain things?
Right. Yeah.
Then you can get super specific with their nutritional needs to hopefully have a healthy outcome.
So, yes, generally with preconception health, we sort of tend to be talking for the male that sort of 3 to 6 months ahead of time, and for the woman, 6 to 12 months ahead of time.
Even better.
Yeah, so that really what we're saying is is with that preconception health, other than just taking vitamins and supplements without really knowing, like adding that layer in, isn't it, of knowledge of around, well, this is your genetics, this is what you're prone to. It just, it's so customized, isn't it?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I guess you must be, because this is a relatively new science, you're so cutting edge in discovering new things. So, you may know that particular gene, but now there's more stuff that you're still finding out, I imagine.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Always. And then the way certain genes interact with other genes.
Right.
Like we've been so focused on things like MTHFR, but now we need to look at, well, if you have an MTHFR variation, how does that play with a COMT variation or a, fill in the blank with any other gene? They're going to play together and create a biochemical misstep somewhere. So,
yeah, I think there is sometimes a bit of a perception out there that that all of that knowledge was already discovered, and they mapped the genome sequence, like it's done, it's ticked off. And I remember just talking to somebody recently about this, and I said, well, it's like they've just worked out the main street and now they need to go down all the side streets.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we're far from knowing everything now.
Yeah.
So what are some of the most common, we've already sort of talked about some of them, but what are some of the most common genetic variations that you see, and what does that exactly mean, particularly in that, spectrum of maternity, with the pregnancy, and, dealing with a new life coming into this world, and what they're inheriting, I guess.
So there are, like you said, there's a lot, and I think there are more coming out of the woodwork, so to speak, than we even know right now. But from just today's research standard, MTHFR is a big one. But we have specific genes that control estrogen and testosterone metabolism, one of which I can think of is called COMT. It's actually a gene that breaks down catecholamines, but so it's more of a neurology based gene. However, there's one particular variation of that gene that seems to make women very sensitive to estrogen. So if you're trying to get pregnant, then you need to make sure their estrogen is balanced wherever it's supposed to be. Now, I'm not a hormone expert by any means in terms of where it needs to be for pregnancy, but the metabolism of said estrogen is pretty interesting when we have that particular genetic variation.
So you must be on quite a little bit of a trial and error in some ways, that as you discover a particular gene does a particular thing, then I guess you're trialing in a way. Sometimes some stuff will be already worked out, of course, but working out, what particular versions of nutrition impact that, and how. Yeah, so what we know now, and again, what we'll know in 2 decades from now, is so, the knowledge base must be expanding, and expecting you would be sort of saying, well, we've got this situation, so we'll use some of this, and we'll try some of, use some of that nutrition and see if it impacts, I guess. So then you'd start off with some baseline blood tests, and then you do some follow-up blood tests and things.
Yeah, so like sorry.
Yeah.
With these particular genetic variations that we know do XYZ, we can say, okay, we know this is involved in maternal health. Now we need to do a micronutrient panel or an organic acid panel to say, okay, this person is actually deficient in certain nutrients. Then we also have to look at the genes to say what forms of nutrients, if we're going to use supplements, what forms of nutrients does this person need? Folic acid tends to be the go-to for folate for pregnancy, but people with an MTHFR variation don't really utilize folic acid that well.
Yeah.
So we have to use methylfolate.
Yes.
But yeah, and I am never going to say genetic testing alone is the answer. I think it's the first step. So I always pair it with micronutrient testing to see what people are actually deficient in. And especially if you're in the preconception phase, or let's say you have a patient that is full on pregnant and you just want to make sure that she's getting the right nutrients for her genetic profile, you can still do that. But micronutrient testing, even if they've got, immune challenges or some other potential symptoms or disease process, you always have to balance that out with genetics too. And I will say one interesting thing is when we know their genetics, we can also know what other environmental things are going to get in the way. Are they going to have a problem with things like heavy metals, or, cleaning products might complicate things with their liver? They can have poor detox pathways, that kind of stuff. We can get super specific knowing their genetics.
Wow.
And, knowing their actual state of health with further lab testing.
That's just fascinating. So what are some of the connections that you see, in your practice, between the health of the mother, during conception and pregnancy, and the health of the child long term and their outcome?
So now you want me to get on my soapbox, is what I hear.
Yeah. Because, at the end of the day, I guess this is the whole crux, isn't it, of
Yeah.
what we, the whole purpose of this preconception is, well, not the whole purpose. I mean,
A large
one
part of it.
purpose is her maternal health during the pregnancy,
Yeah.
but we all know that bigger impact is our child's health going forward. Yeah.
So with my area of specialty, so I take care of mostly spectrum kiddos. So neurology is where a big part of my passion lies. And there is not a single spectrum kiddo. And by spectrum, I mean anything from ADHD to sensory processing disorder and all the way to autism. There's not a single spectrum kid in my practice who's at least one parent has an autoimmune disease. So we're finding a huge connection between Hashimoto's, which is a thyroid autoimmunity, and autism. Excuse me. So when when we get the chance to work with a woman that is in a preconception phase, after genetic testing, because I always do genetic testing on everyone. After genetic testing, the first thing I'm looking at is her thyroid health and her immune health. Excuse me. So if she's got an autoimmune disease, there's a very large percentage that her kiddo is going to end up with a spectrum label, whatever that might be.
Wow. And
So
fascinating. And when you say she's got an autoimmune disease, I mean, obviously, there, a lot of people are aware that they have an autoimmune disease because it impacts their life all the time. But I think that other times there's a bit of a gradient on that, and people can have, right? They can then have a sort of milder version of an autoimmune disease that they don't even realize is, do you see that?
Absolutely. Most people that come to my clinic, well, I'd say I don't know the statistics for sure, but I'd say it's probably 50-50. They either know they have something like, a lot of patients I see have celiac disease or, Crohn's disease or something that's more GI oriented. And then others don't. So Hashimoto's is the thing we find the most often, especially in women. And then things like lupus or RA, sometimes MS. We get a lot, almost every single female in my practice has an autoimmune issue. It's very prevalent.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. And if it's not me finding it, I'm sending them to the right MD to deal with it. But they have just generic symptoms that they think are normal, like IBS or skin conditions, or their hair is falling out. And they always think they're, gaining weight because their hormones are unbalanced. It's like, well, no, actually this is going on. So we have to work with their team of doctors to discover it.
That's fascinating that it's so dominant. And what percentage of the population, would you guess with have an autoimmune disease anyway?
I have no idea. I think it's I think we're dealing with like 80 million Americans we know have autoimmune disease, and those are the ones that are diagnosed.
Right.
So a lot of times the current statistic floating around is that 90% of all hypothyroid patients are actually autoimmunity with Hashimoto's or Graves' disease. So that's a lot of women. So, and it's of course mostly women that tend to be diagnosed with autoimmune diseases. So it's very interesting in my world. Now, granted, I'm, in my clinic, that's who's attracted to my clinic. So of course they're all going to be autoimmune women, and then their spectrum kiddos are the ones I really take care of. So it's that connection for me though is far too real because I see so many spectrum kids, I know far too many women that have an autoimmune disease, and about half of them didn't even know. So
right, that's fascinating. So basically, so every single autistic spectrum child that you're seeing, they're coming from either one or both parents have got autoimmune, and half of those parents didn't realize that they had it. Wow, that's
my tagline is, or my shtick is always that I take care of the spectrum kid and the autoimmune mom. And so when moms look at me like, what do you mean autoimmune mom? I'm like, we'll talk. And sure enough, it turns out they end up with autoimmunity. So it's a big deal.
That's huge. They're big numbers. So, okay, so what are some of the nutritional challenges that, that you see through the different phases of growth from, from really conception, right through as they, grow up as teens? I mean, because we know now that, this preconception health has this lifelong effect on children. But, just to put things into perspective as far as, awareness is concerned, I remember when I was at university, excuse me, studying to become a midwife. And so we're talking, around the sort of the early 2000s. And right at the very end, in the last semester, there was a moment in time when everybody had to do a teaching session. So you are there teaching to the class on a particular topic. And somebody in the class decided to do preconception health. And the thing that's crazy now, looking back on that, is that was the only conversation on all those years at university on studying midwifery on preconception health. It was that new, it was so new that it was a tagged on topic that happened to be having a conversation. And now we're all in a really fairly short period of time, we've got to realize, oh my God, this is huge. And the fact that we've got the ability to influence it and to, make things better. So what are those main challenges, that you see in those different phases? What's the common thread, I guess?
I think at least, okay, I'm speaking as an American here, of course, so I don't know your food supply in New
Well, and then of
Zealand,
course we're an international organization, so but we're generally, most people watching here are from a English speaking country. So it tends to be a little bit, the westernized world.
So,
But I guess
Western diet, processed food, we're all
pretty
the same.
similar-ish diets, whether it's England or Australia or the States or Canada.
Yeah. So one of the biggest issues I see, especially from, preconception health, my goal has always been to educate women and men well before they try to conceive to clean up their diet. So we're very prone to be overworked, overstressed, and eating meals that are convenient and easy. So we tend to have highly processed foods in our diet, which quite frankly don't give us the right nutrition. They might be fortified. They might have a lot of vitamins in them, or not the best forms of vitamins in them, I should say, but they're highly processed. So really getting people back to eating real food, whether it's clean meats, veggies, fruits, whole grains if they eat grains, and not just making meal times fast and convenient for them. That is the number one thing. If I could change for my patients from preconception to adulthood, and especially for the children in between, that would be the biggest rule that I give them. The other thing, however, is that we don't necessarily realize our sensitivities to certain foods, if you will. A large portion of the population is actually sensitive to gluten. They may not have celiac disease, but their genes say that it's going to turn on autoimmunity. So I'm not a gluten-free for all kind of doctor, but I'm a gluten-free for most kind of doctor. And then also really understanding how our bodies deal with carbohydrates and fats. So I've got a lot of patients that are trying to conceive that they don't really process fatty acids very well. It's an inflammatory response for them. So if we put them more on a Mediterranean style diet where the fats that they're getting are like olive oil and avocado and nuts and seeds, they have a much easier time getting pregnant than if they were to eat what we call the standard American diet, SAD diet, right? So from a nutritional perspective, really getting people back to understanding how to eat real food has been one of the biggest struggles that I've dealt with. And it's simply because it's just so easy to eat processed food. And I am not one to point the finger, because I do it as well. So if there's anything I could change, it's getting people back to eating real food, as simple as that sounds.
Right. Yeah. And basic whole food. And I remember somebody saying to me not that long ago, well, what is whole food? Like, what's whole mean? And it's like, well, you haven't done anything to it apart from cook it, or not
It doesn't
even
come
cook
with
it.
a nutrition label because it's not processed.
Yes. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, that's a good description. It doesn't have a label on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's certainly been my biggest struggle as a practitioner, and as a person, it's a big struggle because we're just now growing our own vegetable garden, and we've had like 3 months of growth and one pepper to show for it. So it's
Yes,
very
it's not
easy to
necessarily easy.
yeah, very easy to just get something convenient. So
Yeah. So what are the things that people watching today and watching later, for optimizing nutrition in general, I guess, that really is the thing, is going back to unrefined food, so whole food. And
yeah.
I guess, organically grown, preferentially.
Preferred, chemicals are a big deal, especially in this world. If we're talking pregnancy and conception and pediatrics, whatever it might be, then we have a lot of xenoestrogens in our society. So xenoestrogens are those chemicals that essentially mimic your hormones in your body and can disrupt them. So things from excessive herbicides and pesticides and plastics and a lot of I'd call them environmental waste. So the 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 benefits of industrial society certainly lead us to having a lot of not so beneficial products as well. So removing anything that's going to disrupt our hormone balance and neurotransmitters are a big deal. So that's
So what's say, in an ideal situation when we've got a couple who are planning conception, so they've got time to do preconception health, but maybe they're not in a situation of being able to individually speak with you and get tested by you, or maybe they just don't have access to that sort of stuff at all. I guess what would be the main takeaways, or of not takeaway foods, but what's the main things that we almost consistently, women need to be eating more of or less of, and the men eating more of and less of, any particular food groups, rather than
for sure.
we just get rid of the refined and we dealing with whole foods.
Yeah. I would say, from at least my point of view, there's certain foods that if we would just increase them, even if we didn't take away the junk, let's be realistic and say people are still going to eat what's convenient. If we ate more fatty fish, especially things like salmon, I think we would be healthier, especially wild caught salmon.
Wow.
If we ate more fruits and veggies, we would be healthier. And I would argue lean meats and eggs are probably also great. Eggs are an excellent source of choline, which is required for pregnancy. So eggs are definitely healthy. But if people gravitate more towards lean meats, lots of fatty fish, and fruits and veggies, you really can't go wrong. Even if you're still eating the occasional treat, which we certainly don't want to feel deprived, because conception can also be a very stressful situation for some. But if we gravitate more towards just adding those in, it becomes much easier to make it a habit and to get healthy. And even for kiddos, I deal with picky eaters and kids who refuse to eat their fruits and veggies. But if we start to kind of hide them, or if we give them more fatty acids, their brain starts to develop a little bit better, and they usually are more willing to eat fruits and veggies later on. But I hide spinach in smoothies, or I'll hide hide kale or some sort of veggie in something that my kids thinks is a treat. So there's a lot of ways, but if we just start gravitating for ourselves and for our kiddos in that direction, we're more likely to incorporate it more often. But the number one thing would be fatty fish for sure.
Wow, that's so fascinating. Number one thing would be fatty fish.
Yeah, omega-3s.
Okay, that's of basically increasing that, because it's so often people, yeah, I'd say fish is, unless you live on a coastline, and even then, you know, fish is one of those things that people sort of seem to choose last. You know,
Yeah.
so, you know, that when they're sitting down at a restaurant and they're looking at the menu, you know, it'll be steak or chicken, type of thing. And yeah, okay. And like, to put it into a number, if you could, you know, say how many times a week would you ideally like women preconception and pregnancy to, and men, you know, to have some fatty fish?
I think at minimum 3 times.
Wow.
But for example, we often test omega-3 and omega-6 ratios in the blood for our preconception patients.
Yeah.
And there are some patients that have so little omega-3s that we have to tell them to eat it 11 times a week. Like, that's kind of and who wants to, I mean, you could take a fish oil at that point, but if they can increase their fish, like sardines and anchovies and salmon, those are all really easy fish to come by in most parts of the world.
Yeah.
Then they have a really great omega-3 count that I think most people are going to do better. The cells, you know, we're talking conception. We're talking, you know, forming this new being, right? So, and even in the child that's already here, their brain is developing so quickly if they're, you know, when they're little.
Oh, I mean, that's just brain food, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So from cellular health to brain health, fatty fish is the number one thing. So.
Yeah, and I actually remember a situation with our eldest when, well, we would have, Rick would have been probably about 7 or 8, something like that. And the kids always would have fish oil capsules at dinner time. It was just like part of the routine that, you know, they sit in a container and once a day, and that would be when we'd sit down together for a meal. And we ran out. It was the school holidays. It was the long summer break of holidays. And I just was a bit of a slack mum, really. And then when this child went back to school, they happened, for the next year of school, they happened to have the same teacher again. They ended up having the same teacher over 2 years. And I get pulled into the office to speak to the teacher, and she's like, look, I don't know what's happened over the summer break, but your child's like somewhere on the spectrum at the moment. And I was like, oh my God, I know. I said, look, just give me a month. I'll get this sorted, you know, and back onto that fish oil and absolutely back onto normal function again. It was, you know, it was just such an obvious example of how even something as simple as, you know, fish oil capsules impact brain function.
Absolutely.
It's like a lubricant for the brain, isn't it?
Basically, that's a good way of saying. Yeah. Between that and then eggs with the choline, your cells are going to be very happy. So.
Wow. And what about eggs? How often? Because that's quite a, you know, in pregnancy they sort of talk, particularly in pregnancy. Oh, and that you know, that every part of that egg needs to have been cooked. You know, you can't be really soft boiling eggs during pregnancy. But how many eggs a week would you be suggesting?
So we, just from a milligram perspective, we know that 2 hard-boiled eggs is a decent amount of choline, and choline is that fatty acid that lines every cell membrane. So, you know, if you're doing 2 eggs in the morning for breakfast, that's great. Now, obviously, some people don't tolerate a lot of saturated fat, but 2 eggs is no big deal. in terms of that. So
2 eggs a day. Like if that was your routine little breakfast, then that's absolutely fine.
Yeah. If you're pregnant, we always supplement with choline, but
Right.
2 eggs. I just hard boiled, scrambled, whatever you like. So I'm not too worried about soft boiled, but I'll leave that up to the OBs to tell them.
Boy, isn't that the whole progression of, understanding eggs? I mean, I remember when I was a child, and eggs suddenly became evil, and you had to limit the amount of eggs that you had because of these fears of cholesterol, which of course later were proved completely a total misunderstanding on that. But my father was involved with the egg board at the time, and it devastated the industry. A lot of egg farmers, just their businesses collapsed because overnight people weren't eating eggs. So it is so funny how things, are cyclic, aren't they? And they realize, of course, eggs are fine.
Yeah, they are. And it has to be a whole egg. You have to eat the yolk. You can't just have the egg white.
Yeah, there's so much more nutrition in the yolk, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what are the some of the different things to consider, within that whole natural healthcare world, that may aid for maternal and pediatric health? I mean, what are the main things that you would be thinking about?
Yeah. I think kind of along the lines of everything we've kind of talked about already. So if you're a practitioner and you take care of people that are trying to get pregnant or are pregnant, then obviously genetics is where I start. But really understanding the mother's nutrition while she's pregnant. We've got a lot of issues with gestational diabetes and exhaustion and mommy brain and all those kind of things that moms talk about. But there are so many nutritional things we can do while she's pregnant, specifically making sure our prenatals are better. So if she needs a prenatal, make sure it's active, bioactive nutrients in it. So, you're not just.
And while you make that comment, I'll add in the fact that just because a particular brand of prenatal multi is quite loudly dominating the market, because they've just got a bigger budget and advertising to spend, that does not correlate necessarily with the quality, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
Yeah, right. So in fact, it's almost the one to avoid, because chances are it's coming from a pharmaceutical company that just see it as another income stream. And a lot of the time, some of those lesser known pregnancy multis can be far better quality and oftentimes cheaper.
Yeah. Oh, that's totally my world, because I manufacture supplements. So that's exactly my world. You're spot on. Just because you know the name doesn't mean it's good quality.
No.
So you've already said all that. So I 100% agree. Yeah. So if you're a practitioner, knowing what their nutrient status is, because if you need, let's say mom is deficient in folate, well, she might need more than just a prenatal. She might need a little extra, especially if she's prone to miscarriages or preeclampsia or anything like that. Knowing your patient's diet. So if granted, pregnancy cravings are sometimes hard to avoid, but if she's needing more protein because she's really, sick with morning sickness every day, then being able to tell her, hey, drink a protein smoothie or something that's a little easier on the tummy. Just understanding that it's not just about growing a baby. We've got to nourish the mom. And if we're in preconception phase, we've got to nourish both sets of, the egg and the sperm donor. So we really don't often look at their nutrition as a whole. And it's not that hard. Like, eat more veggies. That's really more veggies, more protein. more omega-3 fatty acids. That's really what it boils down to.
Yes, I remember one Chinese medical herbalist. Well, she's not Chinese, but she
Does
uses
Chinese
Chinese traditional medicine, who's a subfertility specialist. And she said, she goes, sometimes if all I can do is get the guy to just eat one piece of fruit a day,
Yeah.
if that's all I can get of cooperation out of him, she goes, even that has a huge impact.
Yeah. I don't think we're giving enough credit to just fruits and veggies. So
Right. Actually, another question I'm thinking about with the commonest complications that we have, obstetric complexities in pregnancy, would be preeclamptic toxemia, gestational diabetes, and a growth restricted baby, so and which is placental sufficiency or insufficiency. So with those three areas, I know we're generalizing, but are there any particular nutrition preconception or during pregnancy that oh man, those particular food groups really help that area?
yeah, that's where again I'm going to go for omega-3 fatty acids, because you're going to reduce inflammation, right. You're going to balance out blood sugar. Removing processed foods is going to help deal with insulin and glucose spikes. So, if your female is insulin resistant, then that needs to get under control before she gets pregnant to avoid some of those things. But there's actually a lot of genes related to preeclampsia too. So for some people, it may not matter what you're doing. It might just might be a reality for you. So
right. And we also know that sperm is involved with that too. Yes. So sperm health. We don't fully understand exactly how that all impacts, but we definitely know it does. So because there'll be situations where maybe a woman has had 3 children to one partner, never had preeclampsia, then she suddenly has a 4th child to a new partner and she gets it really badly. And so we know that the male is impacting that, definitely. Okay, so I mean, it just comes down to what you were saying before, is increasing, because really if you are increasing the fatty fish as your protein, by default you're going to be decreasing your red meat consumption. You're replacing them as that protein that's sitting on your plate. So that's fascinating. Okay.
And quality has to be considered. I'd rather you eat, I'd almost rather you eat a farm raised fish than conventional beef, but wild caught, pasture raised, organic, grass fed, all those buzzwords, they matter.
Right.
So
yeah. Okay. Oh, it's just been fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. So we're sort of coming to the end of our time today, but is there any other things that you would like to go over, any areas that we haven't really touched on?
I know we said we were going to do pediatric nutrition too, but this is kind of more, I think this is more up your audience's alley anyways, but.
Well, maybe particularly I don't know if you've got any commentary to do with, that first year, because if we've got a baby who is ideally being exclusively breastfed for the first 6 months, obviously what the mother is consuming then is going to be impacting. And of course, that next 6 months, where we're talking about, the very first solid foods that's going into that little munchkin's system. So do you want to talk about that a bit?
And you're going to be surprised by my answer. More omega-3s and fruits and veggies need to be the first thing. So I'm very much against having cereal grains be the first food.
So with you on that.
To the kid, because
it's so inflammatory.
Inflammatory. It's just going to make their taste buds develop for sweet. So avocados, veggies, that's where I'm at. And fish. in
Yeah, in
terms
fact, that's funny because I was told that, well, 25 years ago, which is the age of our eldest, and yeah, I'd started. This is before I was a midwife, before I knew much about all of the stuff now, and in fact, that's probably been one of the big catalysts of me becoming more proactive as a person, as a human being, 25 years ago, where I had started doing that whole traditional thing of, the feeding the baby farrics, the baby rice, the baby porridge. It's all carb, 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 starch, 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 and here's this child, this little munchkin, who's starting to get snotty noses and ear infections and all this. And, I spoke to a naturopath and he goes, oh my God, get that child off all that starch.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the worst thing you could give. And it's fruit and veg, so pureed vegetables, pureed fruit, pureed veg. And yeah, and what a huge difference it makes. Yeah, that's
and it's
so
the same,
interesting.
Yeah, it's the same for mom while she's breastfeeding. The more healthy fats she can eat, the better her milk supply will be. So I'm a big fan of avocado and eggs and salmon and lean red meats and all that kind of stuff. Beef liver if you like it. I personally don't, but some people do. But the healthier
Chicken liver?
huh?
And chicken liver, is there a difference? You
Sure.
mentioned
Chicken
beef
liver.
liver.
Yeah, well, beef liver
Yeah.
is a little bit better from a vitamin perspective, but they both work. Yeah, so the healthier fats, the fruit and veg, it goes for every single person.
Right.
And minimizing the carb introduction for sure.
And so with the baby starting to be fed these solid foods, it was explained to me that that those, yes, that when babies are receiving baby rice, baby farrics, baby muesli, baby anything that's starch, yes, it is in, practically a sloppy pureed form. However, at the end of the day, as humans, we're not designed to be eating that type of starchy, grainy food until our molars are in. Until our grinding teeth are in, and when our grinding teeth are in, that's when the body is ready to have food that you would grind to eat.
And it would be whole grains, not processed grains.
Right, and it would be whole grains. So yeah, that was always a little. So any particular fruits and anything other than fruits and veg that you have an opinion on with regards to those children having that, that first 6 months of their first solids?
I may be a little out of the box here, but my kids eat sardines out of a can.
Excellent.
Yeah. As long as they're not going to choke on it. Sardines, anchovies, salmon, like seriously, if you start kids on fish early, they end up loving it.
Yeah.
So, and it just makes their brains grow so much faster. But yeah, I'm eggs again when they're little, and when they get their little pinchers going, I'm just like putting eggs on their plate, scrambled eggs on their plate, letting them eat that kind of stuff. So
yeah. Brilliant. Yeah. And the thing is that people, when they have not been exposed to, that particularly in that first 6 months of solid foods, when they're from 6 to 12 months old, it is very easy to not be exposing them to, the shite food. Like, it's not hard. You just don't feed it to them. You are 1000% in control of what this child is eating. And with all of our kids, the first time they actually had, true sugar high junk food was their first birthday.
Yeah. With a
cake. And and that's not like it's cruel and denying. It's just like, well, pureed pumpkin is actually quite sweet. you know, and pureed fruit is I mean, yeah, and gosh, it makes such a difference, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And then they like that food because that's what they've always had, rather than I remember one girlfriend, and their child must have been about 7 or 8 months or something, and she did that fatal mistake of buying some a little jar of baby food, but it was some like chocolate mousse or something, but it was, you know, it's a baby food and it's chocolate flavored mousse or something. I'm like, oh my God, you give that's all that kid will ever want once they discover that exists.
Yeah. Once
and
my
kid,
kid,
and it was a problem. She could practically get nothing else into that child from that moment on.
I have a 4 and a 3-year-old, and they think their vitamins are candy. So the moment they realize what real candy is, they're gonna be like, "You've lied." Yeah, if they don't know what they're missing, they're not gonna be as picky as you think they are. So
yeah. Oh, look, it's so great to talk with you. Is that we do need to wind it up. So anything else you want to throw in there, or
no, this was so much fun. Thank you for having me. I hope it was useful information.
Oh, absolutely. And it's that, you know, it's that whole cutting edge again. And actually, before we close, do you want to just explain your contact details as well, particularly for people who would be watching this and further down the track?
Sure. The easiest place to find me is nutritots.com. So that's nutritots.com. That's got all my details on it. So from our social media handles to our phone number and email, everything, that's the easiest way to get a hold of me. So
fantastic. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Hayley.
Thank you.
It was brilliant having you here, and it would be great to get you back again another time. And
happy to,
because we are just dealing with such leading edge knowledge.
Yeah.
So it's very exciting, you know, part of nutritional science, really. So thank you very much, and thank you to those who are live today, and we just wish everybody a wonderful rest of their week. So thank you. Bye everybody. Thanks, Hayley.
Thank you. Bye.